Lisa Carter wiped sweat from her forehead as she walked deeper into the crystal cave. The mining colony of New Denver was hot during the day, but inside these caves the air felt cool and damp. She carried her sample kit in one hand and a bright flashlight in the other. The walls around her sparkled with strange blue crystals that no one had ever seen before. The crystals had appeared 3 weeks ago after the mining crew blasted through a new section of rock. The formations were beautiful but also puzzling. They seemed to grow in perfect geometric patterns, almost like they were made by intelligent beings rather than natural forces. That was why Lisa was here. As the colony's only scientist who studied alien life, it was her job to figure out what these crystals were and if they posed any danger. Lisa had been living on New Denver for 2 years now. She came here after her divorce, wanting to get as far away from Earth as possible. The colony was small, only about 300 people, mostly miners and their families. It was lonely sometimes, but Lisa preferred the quiet to the chaos of her old life. Out here, she could focus on her work without distractions. She stopped in front of a particularly large crystal formation. The blue crystals grew in spirals, reaching up toward the cave ceiling like frozen flames. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, growing brighter and dimmer in a slow rhythm. Lisa had never seen anything like it in all her years studying alien minerals and organisms. She set down her kit and pulled out a small hammer and chisel. The plan was simple: take a few samples back to her lab and run tests to determine what the crystals were made of. If they turned out to be some kind of life form, she would need to be extra careful. The last thing the colony needed was an outbreak of alien bacteria or worse. Lisa positioned her chisel against a smaller crystal near the base of the formation. The crystal felt warm under her touch, almost like it had body heat. She raised her hammer and struck the chisel with a sharp tap. The crystal cracked with a sound like breaking glass, and a small piece fell to the cave floor. But something went wrong. As the crystal broke, it released a cloud of tiny particles that sparkled in her flashlight beam. Lisa tried to step back, but she was too slow. She breathed in some of the particles and felt them tickle her throat. At the same time, a sharp edge of the broken crystal caught her hand, cutting a thin line across her palm. "Damn it," Lisa muttered, dropping her tools and examining the cut. It was not deep, but it was bleeding. She pulled a bandage from her kit and wrapped it around her hand. The particles in the air had already settled, leaving no trace they had ever been there. She picked up the crystal sample and put it in a sealed container. The piece felt strangely warm, warmer than it should be after sitting in a cool cave. Lisa made a mental note to be extra careful when she examined it later. For now, she wanted to get out of the cave and back to the safety of the colony. What Lisa did not know was that the crystal particles she had breathed in contained something alive, something very small but very dangerous. The particles were not really crystal at all, but a kind of shell that protected tiny alien creatures during their long sleep. These creatures had been waiting in the crystals for thousands of years, waiting for the right kind of host to come along. Inside Lisa's body, one of these creatures began to wake up. It was called a Veltar, though Lisa had no way of knowing that name. This particular Veltar had a designation, Zeph 7. It had done this same process many times before on many different worlds. The routine was always the same and always successful. Zeph 7 felt the warm blood flowing around it and knew it had found a host. It began to move through Lisa's bloodstream, heading toward her brain. The Veltar was confident and calm. It had taken control of thousands of creatures before. Some were small and simple, Others were large and complex, but they all fell under Veltar control in the end. This human would be no different. As Zeph 7 traveled through Lisa's body, it studied her biological systems. Humans were similar to many other species the Veltar had conquered. They had a central nervous system, a brain that controlled their actions and predictable patterns of thought. Nothing about this host seemed unusual or challenging. Lisa walked back through the cave, tunnels, unaware of the alien creature moving through her veins. She felt fine, maybe a little tired from the heat and the long walk. Her hand still ached where the crystal had cut her, but the bleeding had stopped. She was thinking about the tests she would run on the crystal sample and what she might discover. The walk back to the colony took about 20 minutes. Lisa emerged from the cave entrance, squinting in the bright sunlight. New Denver spread out before her, a collection of metal buildings and domes connected by covered walkways. In the distance, she could see the big mining machines digging deeper into the planet's surface, always searching for valuable minerals to send back to Earth. She walked to her laboratory, a small building near the center of the colony. Inside, the lab was cool and quiet, filled with the humming of computers and scientific equipment. Lisa set the crystal sample on her main workbench and started preparing for analysis. She wanted to know what made these crystals so unusual. As she worked, Zeph 7 finally reached her brain. The Veltar attached itself to her nervous system and began the process of establishing control. This was the moment that had worked perfectly on every other world the Veltar had visited. Zeph 7 prepared to take over Lisa's mind, confident that within hours it would have complete control over her thoughts and actions. But something felt wrong almost immediately. Instead of the orderly, predictable thought patterns Zeph 7 expected, it found something chaotic and confusing. Lisa's mind was not like the minds of other species. It was wild and unpredictable, full of contradictions and strange ideas that made no sense to the Veltar. For the first time in its long existence, Zeph 7 hesitated. This was not going according to plan. Zeph 7 tried to understand what it was experiencing inside Lisa's mind. The Veltar had taken control of many different species across the galaxy, from simple creatures with basic instincts to advanced beings with complex societies. But this human brain was unlike anything it had ever encountered. Most species thought in straight lines. They had clear goals, logical processes, and predictable reactions. When they were hungry, they looked for food. When they were threatened, they ran or fought. When they were tired, they slept. Their minds were like well-organized libraries, with thoughts filed neatly in their proper places. Lisa's mind was nothing like that. It was more like a tornado filled with books, papers, music, memories, and dreams all swirling around at the same time. She could be thinking about her work, remembering her childhood, worrying about the future, and imagining impossible scenarios all at once. Her thoughts jumped from topic to topic without warning or reason. Right now, as Lisa examined the crystal sample under her microscope, her mind was doing at least 6 different things. She was concentrating on the crystal's structure, but she was also thinking about what to have for dinner, remembering a song she heard that morning, wondering if her ex-husband was happy with his new wife, planning her next research project, and imagining what it would be like to discover a completely new form of life. Zeph 7 tried to focus on just one of these thought streams, but they kept tangling together. When it attempted to control her scientific analysis, her imagination interfered. When it tried to suppress a memory, 3 new ones would pop up to take its place. The Veltar felt like it was trying to grab water with its hands. Even more confusing were the contradictions in Lisa's thinking. She could hold two opposite ideas in her mind at the same time without any problem. She wanted to be alone, but also missed having people around. She was proud of her work, but also doubted her abilities. She loved the excitement of discovery, but feared what she might find. These contradictions should have paralyzed her thinking, but instead they seemed to make her stronger and more creative. Lisa finished her initial examination of the crystal and sat back in her chair. The sample was definitely not a normal mineral. Under the microscope, she could see complex internal structures that looked almost biological, but they were unlike any life form she had studied before. She would need to run more detailed tests to understand what she was dealing with. As she worked, Lisa began to notice something strange. She was having trouble concentrating, which was unusual for her. Her thoughts kept drifting in directions that did not make sense. Sometimes she would start to reach for an instrument and then forget why she wanted it. Other times she would have the feeling that someone was watching her even though she was alone in the lab. Zeph 7 was struggling with these same concentration problems, but for different reasons. Every time it tried to assert control over Lisa's actions, her mind would resist in unexpected ways. When the Veltar attempted to make her stop working and go to the communication center to send a signal to its mothership, Lisa's stubborn curiosity about the crystal would override the command. The Veltar was becoming frustrated and confused. On other worlds, taking control of a host was a simple process. The parasite would establish a connection to the host's nervous system, then gradually override their decision-making centers. The host might feel slightly confused for a few hours, but they would quickly fall under complete Veltar control. With Lisa, every attempt at control created chaos. Her mind seemed to have backup systems for its backup systems. When Zeph 7 blocked one neural pathway, 3 others would activate. When it tried to suppress her curiosity, her imagination would create new questions to explore. When it attempted to make her feel afraid, her sense of humor would find something funny about the situation. Lisa stood up from her workbench and walked to the window. Outside, she could see other colonists going about their daily routines. Jake Murphy, the colony's security chief, was walking between buildings, checking on everything as he did every afternoon. Dr. Ben Foster was tending to the small garden that provided fresh vegetables for the colony. Everything looked normal and peaceful. But Lisa felt like something was wrong. She could not put her finger on what was bothering her. It was like having a word on the tip of her tongue that she could not quite remember, or hearing a sound that was almost too quiet to notice. She shook her head, trying to clear the strange feeling. Inside her mind, Zeph 7 was having its own crisis. The Veltar's confidence was shaking for the first time in its existence. It had been so certain that conquering this human would be easy. Humans seemed like a young species, barely out of their home solar system. They had no special defenses against mental manipulation. Their technology was primitive compared to the civilizations the Veltar had conquered. But Lisa's mind was proving to be the most complex and challenging environment Zeph 7 had ever encountered. Worse, the chaos was starting to affect the Veltar itself. After hours of exposure to human consciousness, Zeph 7 found itself thinking in ways that were foreign to its nature. It was beginning to experience something that might have been curiosity about Lisa's thoughts and feelings. This was dangerous. Veltar were designed to be perfect parasites, focused only on control and conquest. They were not supposed to be curious about their hosts. They were not supposed to be affected by alien emotions. They were certainly not supposed to start questioning their own mission. Lisa returned to her workbench and began preparing the crystal sample for chemical analysis. As she worked, she started humming a song without realizing it. The melody was something she had heard on the radio that morning, but her mind had changed it slightly, adding new notes and rhythms that she thought sounded better. This casual creativity sent shockwaves through Zeph-7's consciousness. The Veltar watched in amazement as Lisa's mind took an existing pattern and improved it without any effort or conscious thought. She was not just remembering the song. She was making it into something new and better. This kind of spontaneous creativity was completely outside the Veltar's understanding. On every other world, the Veltar had found minds that were efficient and logical, but ultimately predictable. They could learn and adapt, but only within certain limits. Human consciousness seemed to have no limits at all. Lisa could imagine things that had never existed, solve problems by thinking about completely unrelated topics, and find connections between ideas that should have had nothing to do with each other. As the day wore on, both Lisa and Zeph-7 grew more unsettled. Lisa could not shake the feeling that something was watching her from inside her own head. The Veltar, meanwhile, was beginning to realize that it might have made a serious mistake. This human was not like the others. Her mind was not something that could be easily controlled. For the first time in its long history of conquest, Zeph-7 wondered if it had chosen the wrong host. 3 days had passed since Lisa cut her hand on the crystal, and the strange feelings in her head were getting worse. She would be working in her lab when suddenly she would feel like she was watching herself from outside her own body. Sometimes she would start to do something and then find herself doing something completely different, without remembering why she had changed her mind. The worst part was the whispers. They were so quiet that she was not even sure they were real. Sometimes she thought she heard a voice speaking in a language she did not recognize, like someone talking in the next room with the volume turned very low. When she would stop what she was doing to listen carefully, the sounds would disappear. Lisa had always been good at solving problems, but this problem was inside her own head, and that made it much harder to study. She tried to approach it scientifically, keeping notes about when the strange feelings happened and what might be causing them. But the patterns made no sense. The episodes seemed to happen randomly, with no connection to what she was doing or how she was feeling. What Lisa did not know was that Zeph-7 was having just as much trouble understanding what was happening. The Veltar had tried every technique it knew for taking control of a host mind, but nothing worked on Lisa. Every time it thought it was making progress, her consciousness would do something unexpected that would break its concentration. Zeph-7 had discovered that human minds were not just chaotic, they were actively creative. Lisa's thoughts were constantly generating new ideas, new connections, and new possibilities. It was like trying to control a river that kept changing course. Just when the Veltar thought it understood which direction, her thoughts were flowing. They would suddenly turn and head somewhere completely different. Even more disturbing was how Lisa's creativity was affecting Zeph-7 itself. The Veltar found itself becoming curious about human art, music, and stories. When Lisa remembered a book she had read, Zeph-7 experienced the emotions and ideas from that book as if they were its own memories. When she imagined what it might be like to explore distant planets, the Veltar felt something it had never experienced before: wonder. This was completely against Veltar nature. The parasites were designed to be single-minded in their purpose. They existed only to conquer and control. They were not supposed to waste time on abstract concepts like beauty or adventure. They certainly were not supposed to enjoy the process of discovery and learning. But exposure to Lisa's mind was changing Zeph 7 in ways that frightened it. The Veltar was beginning to understand concepts that had no practical purpose. It was starting to appreciate the difference between a good song and a bad song, even though music served no survival function. It was developing preferences about food, colors, and weather, even though these things had no impact on its mission. On the fourth day, everything changed. Lisa was working late in her lab, running additional tests on the crystal samples. She had discovered that the crystals contained traces of organic compounds that should not exist in natural minerals. The patterns were too complex and too organized to be random. Something had created these crystals, and that something was probably alive. As she studied the data on her computer screen, Lisa suddenly felt a strange sensation in her mind. It was like someone had turned on a radio in her head and was slowly adjusting the volume. The whispers she had been hearing became clearer, and for the first time, she could almost make out actual words. "What are you?" she said out loud, surprising herself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Lisa felt something that was definitely not her own thoughts. It was like hearing an echo of her question, but the echo was coming from inside her head instead of from the walls of the lab. Zeph 7 realized that something fundamental had just changed. Somehow Lisa had become aware of its presence. This had never happened before with any other host. Most species never realized they were being controlled. Their minds simply accepted the Veltar's influence as their own thoughts and desires. But Lisa was actively looking for the source of the strange feelings she had been experiencing. Her scientific training had taught her to investigate unusual phenomena rather than ignore them. Instead of dismissing the whispers as stress or imagination, she was treating them as data to be analyzed. "I know you're there," Lisa said, speaking to the empty lab. "I can feel you in my head. What are you?" This direct communication sent shockwaves through Zeph 7's consciousness. The Veltar found itself in completely unknown territory. It had protocols for conquest, for control, and for communication with its own kind, but it had no experience with negotiating with a host. For several minutes, both Lisa and Zeph 7 remained silent, each trying to understand what was happening. Lisa sat very still in her chair, focusing on the alien presence in her mind. Zeph 7 struggled with the decision of whether to respond to her question. Finally, the Veltar decided to try something it had never done before. Instead of trying to control Lisa's thoughts, it tried to communicate with them. The process was clumsy and difficult, like learning to speak a foreign language. But slowly, Zeph 7 managed to form words that Lisa could understand. "I am Veltar," the voice in Lisa's head said. The words felt strange and cold, like they were coming from somewhere very far away. Lisa's heart started beating faster, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was the discovery of a lifetime. Direct contact with an alien intelligence. She had to handle this situation carefully. "What do you want?" she asked. "Control," Zeph 7 answered honestly. "I was sent to take control of your kind." This answer should have terrified Lisa, but instead it made her angry. She had spent her whole life studying and respecting alien life forms. The idea that this creature wanted to enslave humanity was both frightening and insulting. "Well, that's not going to happen," she said firmly. "I don't know what you are or where you came from, but you picked the wrong species to mess with." Zeph-7 was surprised by her reaction. Most species, when they learned about the Veltar's purpose, responded with fear or despair. Lisa's defiance was something new. Even more surprising was how her anger seemed to strengthen her mind's resistance to Veltar influence. "You cannot stop me," Zeph-7 said. But even as it spoke the words, the Veltar was no longer sure they were true. "Watch me," Lisa replied. What happened next was unlike anything in Veltar history. Instead of trying to hide from the parasite or submit to its control, Lisa began actively fighting back. She used meditation techniques she had learned years ago to focus her mind and compartmentalize her thoughts. She imagined building walls around the most important parts of her consciousness, protecting them from alien influence. But more than that, Lisa began studying Zeph-7 the same way she studied any other life form. She observed its patterns, analyzed its behavior, and looked for weaknesses. The Veltar found itself being examined and categorized like a specimen in a lab. This reversal of roles was deeply disturbing to Zeph-7. It was used to being the observer, the controller, the dominant intelligence. Being studied by its intended host was humiliating and confusing. Worse, Lisa's scientific approach to understanding the Veltar was teaching her how to resist its influence more effectively. As the night wore on, the battle for control of Lisa's mind continued. But it was no longer clear who was winning. Zeph-7 had the advantage of being specifically designed for mental domination, but Lisa had something the Veltar had never encountered before: a human mind's infinite capacity for creative resistance. The war between Parasite and Host had begun, and both sides were learning that this fight would be unlike any that had come before. The mental connection between Lisa and Zeph-7 grew stronger over the following days, but not in the way the Veltar had planned. Instead of gaining control over Lisa's mind, Zeph-7 found itself being pulled deeper into her consciousness. The Parasite was experiencing human thoughts and emotions more directly than it had ever experienced anything from its previous hosts. Through Lisa's memories, Zeph-7 began to understand what made humans different from other species. The Veltar watched in fascination as Lisa's mind replayed scenes from human history: ancient humans leaving Africa to explore unknown continents, scientists making discoveries that changed the world, ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of courage and kindness. What struck Zeph-7 most was how humans responded to impossible situations. Other species, when faced with overwhelming odds, would either fight until they died or surrender and accept their fate. Humans did something else entirely. They would find creative solutions that no one had thought of before, or they would refuse to accept that the situation was impossible in the first place. Lisa's own life was full of examples of this human stubbornness. When she was a child, doctors told her parents she might never walk normally because of a birth defect in her leg. Instead of accepting this limitation, Lisa had worked harder than anyone thought possible to prove them wrong. By the time she was a teenager, she was not just walking but running marathons. When her marriage fell apart, friends advised her to find a safe job and settle down somewhere comfortable. Instead, Lisa had applied for the most challenging and isolated research position she could find. When other scientists said the new Denver crystals were probably just unusual rock formations, Lisa had insisted on studying them personally, even though it meant spending weeks alone in dangerous caves. Zeph-7 began to realize that this pattern of behavior was not unique to Lisa. Through her memories of human history and culture, the Veltar saw that all humans seemed to share this strange tendency to push beyond their limits. They would attempt things that should have been impossible and somehow find ways to succeed. Even more puzzling to Zeph-7 was how humans dealt with failure. When other species failed at something important, they would typically give up or find a different approach. Humans would often become more determined after failure, as if the setback had made them stronger rather than weaker. They seemed to learn from their mistakes in ways that actually improved their abilities. Lisa was demonstrating this right now in their mental battle. Every time Zeph-7 tried a new method of control, Lisa would figure out how to resist it and then develop better defenses against similar attacks. The Veltar's attempts to dominate her were actually teaching her how to fight back more effectively. But the connection was affecting Lisa as well. Through Zeph-7's memories, she was learning about the Veltar's long history of conquest across the galaxy. She saw proud civilizations reduced to mindless slaves, entire worlds stripped of their resources to feed the Veltar war machine, and billions of intelligent beings who had lost everything that made them who they were. The scale of the destruction was overwhelming. The Veltar had been spreading across the galaxy for thousands of years, conquering world after world. They were like a plague that turned living civilizations into dead puppet states. Zeph-7's own kind had long ago forgotten what it meant to live freely or think independently. They existed only to serve the collective will of the Veltar Empire. What horrified Lisa most was how efficient the process had become. The Veltar had perfected the art of conquest through mind control. They would send small scouting forces to study new species, then deploy parasites specifically designed to exploit the mental weaknesses of each particular race. Most civilizations fell within weeks of first contact. "How many worlds have you destroyed?" Lisa asked during one of their mental conversations. "We do not destroy," Zeph-7 replied. "We improve. We bring order to chaos, purpose to confusion. You call slavery improvement?" This question made Zeph-7 pause. The concept of slavery was one of many human ideas that the Veltar was struggling to understand. In Veltar society, there was no distinction between individual and collective will. Everyone served the same purpose, followed the same goals, and shared the same thoughts. The idea that this unity might be seen as a form of imprisonment was alien to Zeph-7's thinking, but exposure to Lisa's consciousness was teaching the Veltar about concepts like individual freedom, personal choice, and self-determination. Through her memories, Zeph-7 experienced what it felt like to make decisions based on personal desires rather than collective needs. The parasite was beginning to understand that what the Veltar saw as perfect order, other species might experience as living death. "Your people," Zeph-7 said slowly, "they value their individual thoughts more than the good of the whole?" "We value both," Lisa replied. "But we believe that a group is stronger when it's made up of free individuals who choose to work together rather than slaves who have no choice." This idea was revolutionary to Zeph-7. The Veltar Empire was built on the opposite principle, that perfect unity required the elimination of individual will. But Lisa's memories showed examples of human groups accomplishing incredible things. Precisely because they were made up of different people with different ideas and different strengths. The more Zeph-7 learned about human society, the more confused it became about its own purpose. The Veltar had always believed that mind control was a gift they gave to other species, freeing them from the chaos and conflict of individual thought. But Lisa's mind was showing the parasite that this chaos and conflict might actually be the source of human strength rather than a weakness to be eliminated. As days passed, Zeph-7 found itself changing in ways that should have been impossible. The Veltar was beginning to experience emotions that had no place in its original programming. Curiosity about things that served no practical purpose, appreciation for beauty and art, and something that might have been empathy for the suffering of other beings. Most disturbing of all, Zeph 7 was beginning to doubt the righteousness of the Veltar mission. For the first time in its existence, the parasite wondered if there might be something wrong with a system that required the complete destruction of individual consciousness. Lisa sensed these changes in Zeph 7's thinking, and she began to understand that she might have found something more valuable than just a way to resist the parasite's control. She might have found a way to change the nature of the Veltar themselves. "What if you didn't have to conquer us?" she asked one evening as she worked alone in her lab. "What if there was another way?" "There is no other way," Zeph 7 replied, but the certainty that had once filled its voice was no longer there. "There's always another way," Lisa said with the stubborn confidence that had carried humans from caves to starships. "We just have to be creative enough to find it." For Zeph 7, those words opened up possibilities that the Veltar had never considered. Maybe conquest was not the only option. Maybe there were alternatives that no one had ever thought to explore. But exploring those alternatives would require Zeph 7 to do something that went against every instinct the Veltar possessed. It would require the parasite to trust a human. 2 weeks after first contact with Zeph 7, Lisa was exhausted. The constant mental battle with the Veltar was draining her energy faster than she could recover it. She had lost weight and was having trouble sleeping. Other colonists were starting to notice that something was wrong with her, but she could not tell anyone the truth. Who would believe that she had an alien parasite in her head that was slowly learning to doubt its own mission? Zeph 7 was in even worse condition. The Veltar's exposure to human consciousness was fundamentally changing its nature in ways that caused intense psychological pain. Everything the parasite had believed about itself and its purpose was being questioned. Concepts that had been central to Veltar identity for thousands of years now seemed questionable or even wrong. The breaking point came when Zeph 7 tried to access Lisa's memories of her childhood and accidentally experienced her emotions about the death of her pet dog when she was 8 years old. The grief, love, and sense of loss hit the Veltar like a physical blow. For the first time in its existence, Zeph 7 understood what it meant to mourn for something that could never be replaced. This emotional shock taught the parasite something terrible about its own past actions. Every time the Veltar conquered a species, they were not just taking control of bodies and minds. They were destroying something precious and irreplaceable, the unique consciousness and culture that made each species special. The Veltar were not bringing order to chaos. They were erasing the beautiful complexity that made life worth living. "I cannot continue this," Zeph 7 said suddenly during one of their mental conversations. Lisa was surprised by the anguish in the parasite's voice. Over the past weeks, she had watched Zeph 7 struggle with concepts that challenged everything it had ever known. The Veltar was experiencing something like a breakdown as its fundamental beliefs crumbled under the weight of human consciousness. "Cannot. Continue what?" Lisa asked. "The conquest. The control. I understand now what we have been doing. We have been destroying the very thing that makes life valuable." Lisa felt a moment of hope, but also concern. If Zeph 7 was having this crisis, what would happen when it tried to return to its own kind? And what about the other Veltar who were surely coming to complete the invasion? "What will you do?" she asked. "I do not know," Zeph 7 replied. "I was created for conquest. I have no other purpose. If I cannot conquer, then what am I? This existential crisis was tearing the Veltar apart from the inside. Zeph 7 had been designed to be a perfect parasite, but exposure to human consciousness had given it something that parasites were not supposed to have, a conscience. The guilt and shame the Veltar felt about its past actions were becoming unbearable. But the crisis was also dangerous for Lisa. As Zeph 7's mental state deteriorated, its control over its own abilities was breaking down. The parasite's distress was causing random surges of alien thoughts and emotions to flood through Lisa's mind. Sometimes she would suddenly feel overwhelming guilt about things she had never done. Other times she would be struck by waves of grief for people she had never met. The worst episodes came when Zeph 7's memories of past conquests leaked into Lisa's consciousness. She would suddenly experience the final moments of entire civilizations as they fell under Veltar control. She felt the despair of beings who watched their children turned into mindless drones, the horror of leaders who realized their orders were no longer their own, and the terrible silence that fell over worlds when the last free thoughts were extinguished. These experiences left Lisa physically sick and emotionally devastated. She began to understand the true scope of what the Veltar had done across the galaxy. The number of lives destroyed, the cultures erased, and the potential lost was beyond imagination. It was genocide on a scale that made the worst crimes in human history seem small by comparison. But instead of making her hate Zeph 7, these revelations made Lisa more determined to find a solution. She could see that the Veltar was genuinely suffering from the knowledge of what it had done. The parasite was trapped in a system that forced it to commit acts that it now understood were monstrous. You don't have to be what you were created to be, Lisa told Zeph 7 during one of its worst episodes. Humans aren't prisoners of our programming either. We choose who we want to become. Choice. Zeph 7 said the word like it was a foreign concept. Individual choice was eliminated from Veltar society long ago. We do what we are designed to do. We serve the collective will. But you're questioning that will now. That means you do have choice. You're just afraid to use it. This conversation planted a seed of possibility in Zeph 7's mind. The Veltar began to consider what it might be like to exist as an individual rather than just a part of the collective. But this consideration brought new fears. If Zeph 7 chose to rebel against its programming, it would be alone in a way that no Veltar had ever been alone before. Meanwhile, Lisa was dealing with a different kind of crisis. The strain of fighting off Zeph 7's control attempts while also trying to help the parasite work through its existential breakdown was pushing her to her limits. She was making mistakes in her work, forgetting important details, and having trouble maintaining normal conversations with other colonists. Jake Murphy, the colony's security chief, had noticed her strange behavior and was starting to ask questions. Ben Foster, the colony doctor, had commented that she looked sick and offered to run some medical tests. Lisa knew she could not keep her condition secret much longer, but she also knew that revealing the truth would cause panic among the colonists. The situation became even more complicated when Zeph 7 detected something that made both of them freeze with terror. The Veltar's enhanced senses picked up a signal from deep space. The approaching Veltar mothership was much closer than expected. Instead of arriving in months or years, the main invasion force would reach Earth's solar system in a matter of weeks. They are coming, Zeph 7 announced with dread in its voice. The mothership carries millions of my kind. When they arrive, there will be no stopping the conquest of your species. Lisa felt her heart sink. She had hoped they would have more time to find a solution. But now she realized that their personal struggle was about to become a fight for the survival of humanity itself. "Can you contact them?" Lisa asked. "Can you tell them what you've learned about us?" "I could try," Zeph7 replied, "but they would not listen. They would see my changed state as evidence that I have been corrupted by human influence. They would simply send another parasite to complete my mission." Lisa sat in her lab chair, staring at the wall as the magnitude of their situation hit her. In a few weeks, millions of alien parasites would arrive with the goal of enslaving every human in the solar system. The only Veltar who understood why this was wrong was trapped inside her head and slowly falling apart from guilt and confusion. But even in this desperate situation, Lisa's human optimism refused to give up. There had to be a way to use what they had learned to save both species. She just had to be creative enough to find it. "What if we don't try to stop them?" she said suddenly. "What if we do something even better?" "What do you mean?" Zeph7 asked. "What if we find a way to give them the same experience you've had? What if we can show them what human consciousness is really like?" The idea was crazy, dangerous, and probably impossible, but it was also exactly the kind of stubborn human refusal to accept defeat that had brought her species from caves to the stars. Zeph7 considered the proposal with growing excitement and terror. It might work, but the risks were enormous. If they failed, they would have made the conquest of humanity even easier for the Veltar fleet. But if they succeeded, they might find a way to save both species from destruction. Time was running out faster than Lisa had expected. Zeph7's enhanced senses were now picking up more detailed information about the approaching Veltar fleet, and the news was worse than either of them had feared. The mothership was not just carrying millions of parasites. It was also equipped with technology that could amplify Veltar mental control across entire planets. Once the ship reached Earth, the conquest would happen within hours rather than days or weeks. Lisa knew she had to act quickly, but her plan was still more hope than strategy. The idea of somehow transmitting human consciousness to the Veltar fleet sounded impossible when she said it out loud. How could she broadcast something as complex and chaotic as human thought across space? And even if she could, would it have the same effect on other Veltar that proximity to her mind had on Zeph7? The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing her research notes on the crystal formations, Lisa realized that the crystals were not just containers for dormant Veltar. They were also sophisticated communication devices, designed to transmit mental patterns across vast distances. The Veltar had essentially built a galaxy-spanning network for sharing consciousness between their scattered forces. The crystals, Lisa said excitedly during one of her mental conversations with Zeph7. "They're like biological radio transmitters, aren't they?" "Yes," Zeph7 confirmed. "They allow the collective consciousness to remain connected across space. All Veltar are linked through the crystal network. Then we can use them to transmit human consciousness to your fleet." The idea terrified Zeph7. Using the crystal network to broadcast alien thoughts to the Veltar collective would be seen as an act of war. If the transmission failed to change the other Veltar, it would simply alert them to the existence of resistance on Earth and make them more cautious in their approach. But as Zeph7 considered the proposal more carefully, it began to see the potential. The Veltar were unprepared for exposure to human consciousness. They had conquered species with orderly, predictable minds, but they had no defense against the creative chaos that defined human thought. If Lisa could find a way to amplify and focus her consciousness through the crystal network, it might indeed cause the same kind of crisis among the fleet that Zeph-7 was experiencing. The technical challenges were enormous. Lisa would need to modify the colony's communication equipment to interface with the alien crystals. She would have to find a way to convert human brain patterns into a form that the Veltar network could transmit, and she would have to do all of this without alerting the other colonists to what was happening. But the biggest challenge was personal. To broadcast her consciousness with enough power to reach the Veltar fleet, Lisa would have to open her mind completely to Zeph-7. She would have to trust the Parasite with access to her deepest thoughts, memories, and emotions. Given that Zeph-7 was still struggling with its own transformation, this level of mental intimacy was extremely risky. Lisa spent 3 days preparing for the attempt. She worked alone in her lab, modifying communication equipment and studying the structure of the alien crystals. She had to be careful to make her work look like normal research in case Jake Murphy or anyone else decided to check on her progress. The hardest part was not having anyone to talk to about what she was planning. Lisa had always worked better when she could discuss her ideas with colleagues, but this time she was completely on her own. Well, not completely alone. She had Zeph-7, but the Veltar's advice came with the constant reminder that they were about to attempt something that could doom both their species if it went wrong. As Lisa worked, other colonists began to notice her increasingly strange behavior. She was spending 18 hours a day in her lab, barely eating, and avoiding all social contact. When Ben Foster tried to insist on giving her a medical examination, she became agitated and defensive in ways that were completely unlike her normal personality. Jake Murphy was particularly concerned. As head of colony security, he was responsible for the safety of everyone on New Denver. Lisa's behavior was setting off all his professional instincts that something was seriously wrong. He began quietly investigating her recent activities, trying to figure out what had caused such a dramatic change in her personality. What Jake found made him even more worried. Lisa had been accessing the colony's communication systems at odd hours, requesting technical manuals for equipment that had nothing to do with her research, and spending far more time in the crystal caves than any safety protocol recommended. When he tried to ask her about these activities, she gave answers that were technically truthful, but clearly incomplete. Meanwhile, Zeph-7 was having its own crisis of confidence. The closer they came to attempting the broadcast, the more the Veltar worried about what would happen to Lisa if the plan failed. The amount of mental energy required to transmit human consciousness across space would be enormous. There was a real possibility that the effort would damage Lisa's mind permanently, leaving her in a catatonic state or worse. Even more troubling was what might happen if the plan succeeded. If the broadcast did cause other Veltar to undergo the same transformation that Zeph-7 had experienced, the results could be chaotic and unpredictable. Millions of parasites suddenly developing individual consciousness and free will might not respond with peaceful enlightenment. They might react with violence, madness, or suicidal despair. "Are you certain you want to do this?" Zeph-7 asked on the night before the planned transmission. "The risks are greater than either of us can fully calculate." Lisa paused in her work and considered the question seriously. She was about to bet the future of humanity on a plan that was based more on hope than science. If she was wrong about the nature of human consciousness or the effect it would have on the Veltar, she would be handing Earth to its conquerors. But the alternative was to do nothing and watch her species fall under alien control within weeks. Lisa had spent her career studying life in all its forms, and she knew that consciousness was the most precious thing in the universe. The idea of billions of humans reduced to mindless puppets was worse than any personal risk she might face. "I'm certain," she said finally, "if we don't try this, humanity loses anyway. At least this way we have a chance." Zeph 7 felt something that might have been admiration for Lisa's courage. The Veltar had conquered species that were physically stronger, technologically more advanced, and longer lived than humans. But none of them had possessed this stubborn refusal to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Maybe that quality was exactly what made human consciousness so dangerous to Veltar control. As Lisa made final preparations for the transmission, she tried not to think about all the ways the plan could go wrong. Instead, she focused on what she hoped to accomplish. If even a small percentage of the Veltar fleet could be shown the value of individual consciousness and free choice, it might be enough to prevent the invasion. And if more of them could be convinced to abandon conquest in favor of cooperation, it might open up possibilities that neither species had ever imagined. The equipment was ready. The crystals were positioned correctly. The communication array was configured to broadcast on frequencies that the Veltar network would recognize. Everything was in place for humanity's most desperate gamble. Lisa sat down at her workstation and took a deep breath. In a few minutes, she would open her mind completely to an alien intelligence and trust it to help her save both their species. It was either the most foolish thing she had ever done or the most important. "Are you ready?" she asked Zeph 7. "I am ready," the Veltar replied, though its voice carried the weight of centuries of doubt and newly awakened conscience. Lisa activated the transmission array and felt the alien crystals come alive with energy. The moment of truth had arrived. The moment Lisa activated the transmission array, she felt like her consciousness exploded outward from her body. Through Zeph 7's connection to the Veltar crystal network, her mind suddenly had access to a communication system that spanned half the galaxy. She could sense millions of alien intelligences linked together in a vast collective consciousness, all focused on the single goal of conquest and control. The sensation was overwhelming. Lisa had to fight to maintain her sense of individual identity, as her thoughts were swept into the Veltar network. It was like trying to remain standing in a river that was moving faster than anything she had ever experienced. Only Zeph 7's guidance kept her from being completely lost in the alien collective. "Focus on who you are," Zeph 7 urged her through their mental link. "Remember what makes you human. That is what we need to transmit." Lisa struggled to organize her thoughts while maintaining the connection. She tried to think about everything that defined human consciousness: creativity, stubbornness, the ability to hold contradictory ideas at the same time, the refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible. But more than that, she tried to transmit the emotions that drove human behavior: love, hope, curiosity, and the fierce determination to protect the people and things they cared about. The effect on the Veltar network was immediate and dramatic. The collective consciousness, which had been focused and unified for thousands of years, suddenly encountered something that was neither focused nor unified. Lisa's chaotic human thoughts crashed into the orderly Veltar mind space like a storm hitting a calm lake. Across the approaching fleet, individual Veltar began experiencing something they had never felt before: confusion about their mission. The parasites that were closest to the transmission source were hit hardest. They found themselves questioning orders that had never been questioned before, wondering about the value of individual consciousness, and experiencing emotions that had no place in their collective purpose. On the mothership, the Veltar commanders immediately recognized that something was wrong. Their perfectly coordinated fleet was developing inconsistencies in behavior and purpose. Some ships began slowing their approach to Earth. Others started requesting clarification of orders that had always been clear. A few even began broadcasting questions about the ethics of conquest and control. The commanders tried to shut down the alien transmission, but they quickly discovered that it was not coming from any technology they recognized. The signal seemed to be using their own crystal network against them, turning their greatest strength into a vulnerability. Worse, the closer they got to the source of the transmission, the stronger the effect became. Back on New Denver, Lisa was barely holding on to consciousness. The effort of broadcasting her thoughts across space while maintaining her connection to the alien network was draining her life force. She could feel her body shutting down as her mind was stretched beyond its limits. Blood was trickling from her nose, and her vision was beginning to blur. "I cannot maintain this much longer," she gasped to Zeph-7. "You must," the Veltar replied, but its voice was filled with anguish. Zeph-7 could see that the transmission was killing Lisa, but stopping now would doom both their species. "The effect is spreading through the fleet, but it needs more time to reach critical mass." Lisa forced herself to continue, drawing on reserves of determination she did not know she possessed. She thought about every human who had ever lived, everyone who had struggled and died for the chance to think their own thoughts and make their own choices. She thought about the billions of people on Earth who had no idea that their freedom was being decided at this moment by a scientist in a small laboratory on a distant mining colony. The transmission continued to wreak havoc among the Veltar fleet. The parasites that had been exposed to human consciousness for the longest time were undergoing complete personality changes. They were developing individual identities, personal preferences, and independent moral judgment. Some were horrified by their past actions and wanted to make amends. Others were overwhelmed by the complexity of individual consciousness and retreated into catatonic states. Most importantly, many of the affected Veltar were beginning to communicate with each other as individuals rather than as parts of a collective. They were sharing their doubts, fears, and newfound understanding of what they had been doing to other species. This individual communication was something the Veltar collective had never experienced, and it was spreading faster than the commanders could control. But the most dramatic change was happening to Veltar, who had been designated for command positions. These parasites had been given enhanced mental abilities to coordinate large-scale operations, which made them even more susceptible to the chaotic influence of human consciousness. When they began questioning their orders and developing individual, moral judgment, their subordinates followed their lead. Within hours of Lisa's transmission, entire sections of the Veltar fleet were in rebellion against the collective consciousness. Ships that had been perfectly coordinated were now operating independently, with their crews debating among themselves about whether the invasion should continue. The Veltar commanders realized they were facing a crisis unlike anything in their species' history. The alien transmission was not just disrupting their communications, it was fundamentally changing the nature of their soldiers. If the effect continued to spread, it would destroy the unity that had made Veltar conquest possible. In due desperation, the commanders ordered the fleet to withdraw from the solar system and regroup at a safe distance. They hoped that removing their forces from the source of the transmission would stop the spread of individual consciousness among their troops. But they quickly discovered that the damage was already done. The Veltar who had been exposed to Human consciousness could not return to their previous state of collective thinking. On New Denver, Lisa finally collapsed as the Veltar fleet began its withdrawal. The transmission had lasted for nearly 6 hours, far longer than anyone could have expected her to survive. She was unconscious and barely breathing, but she had accomplished something that no one in the galaxy had ever thought possible. She had turned the Veltar's greatest weapon against them. Zeph 7 was also in crisis. The Parasite had been forced to serve as a bridge between human and Veltar consciousness during the entire transmission. The experience had completed its transformation from collective drone to individual being, but the process had been traumatic and disorienting. Zeph 7 was no longer truly Veltar, but it was not human either. It was something new and unprecedented. Jake Murphy found Lisa unconscious in her laboratory 3 hours later. He had been investigating the strange energy readings that the colony's sensors had detected during the transmission. When he discovered Lisa surrounded by modified communication equipment and alien crystals, he immediately called for medical help and began trying to piece together what had happened. Dr. Ben Foster worked for hours to stabilize Lisa's condition. She was suffering from severe exhaustion, dehydration, and what appeared to be some kind of neurological trauma. Her brain scans showed patterns that Foster had never seen before, as if her neural pathways had been temporarily rewired by some external force. But the most puzzling discovery came when Foster noticed that Lisa seemed to be carrying on conversations with someone who was not there. She would mumble questions and then pause as if listening to answers that only she could hear. When Foster asked her who she was talking to, Lisa's only response was, "A friend who learned to choose." As news of the Veltar fleet's withdrawal reached Earth through deep space monitoring stations, no one understood the connection to the events on New Denver. Humanity celebrated what appeared to be a mysterious reprieve from alien invasion, not knowing that their salvation had come from a single scientist who refused to accept that conquest was inevitable. But the story was far from over. The Veltar fleet might have withdrawn, but the crisis among their ranks was just beginning. And on New Denver, Lisa was slowly recovering from her ordeal, unaware that her actions had started a revolution that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. 3 weeks after the transmission, Lisa was finally strong enough to leave the colony's medical facility. Her recovery had been slow and complicated by the fact that Dr. Foster could not understand what had caused her condition. The brain scans still showed unusual neural activity, and Lisa continued to have conversations with someone that no one else could see or hear. Jake Murphy had conducted a thorough investigation of Lisa's laboratory and discovered evidence of unauthorized modifications to colony communication equipment. But when he tried to question Lisa about what she had been doing, she gave answers that were clearly incomplete. She admitted to conducting experiments with the alien crystals, but claimed not to remember the details due to her medical condition. What Jake did not know was that Lisa remembered everything perfectly. She was simply being careful about how much she revealed. The truth about Zeph 7 and the Veltar invasion was too dangerous to share without careful consideration of the consequences. If humanity learned that aliens had already attempted to conquer them, it might trigger panic or aggressive responses that could make future contact more difficult. Zeph 7 was also being cautious about their situation. The Veltar had completed its transformation from collective drone to individual consciousness, but it was still learning how to exist as a free being. The Parasite no longer wanted to control Lisa's mind, but it was not sure how to live without some kind of purpose or mission. "What do we do now?" Zeph-7 asked during one of their private mental conversations. "We figure it out as we go," Lisa replied. "That's what humans do when we don't have all the answers." This response highlighted one of the biggest differences between human and Veltar thinking. The Veltar had always operated according to predetermined plans and collective decisions. The idea of improvising solutions to unexpected problems was completely foreign to their nature. But Zeph-7 was slowly learning to appreciate the flexibility and creativity that came with individual thinking. Meanwhile, the effects of Lisa's transmission were spreading throughout the galaxy in ways that neither she nor Zeph-7 could have predicted. The Veltar fleet that had withdrawn from Earth was in complete chaos. Roughly half of the parasites had been affected by exposure to human consciousness, and they were no longer capable of functioning as a unified force. Some of the affected Veltar had formed small groups and were trying to establish independent colonies where they could explore what it meant to live as individuals. Others were attempting to make contact with species that the Veltar had conquered in the past, hoping to make amends for their actions. A few had suffered complete psychological breakdowns and required care from their fellow rebels. The Veltar, commanders who remained loyal to the collective consciousness, were facing an impossible situation. They could not simply destroy the rebels because Veltar society had no experience with internal conflict. Their entire civilization was built on the assumption that all members shared the same goals and beliefs. The existence of Veltar who actively opposed the collective will was a contradiction that their leaders could not resolve. More seriously, the rebellion was continuing to spread. The affected Veltar were sharing their experiences of individual consciousness with others, and some of those who had not been directly exposed to the human transmission were beginning to question their own loyalty to the collective. The concepts of free will, personal choice, and individual moral responsibility were proving to be as contagious as any biological virus. On Earth, humanity remained unaware of the cosmic drama that Lisa's actions had triggered. Government officials knew that an alien fleet had approached the solar system and then mysteriously withdrawn, but they had no idea why. Scientists and military leaders were developing theories about everything from technical malfunctions to internal alien conflicts, but none of them came close to the truth. Lisa watched the news reports about the alien fleet with mixed feelings. She was relieved that her plan had worked and that humanity had avoided conquest, but she was also worried about what was happening to the Veltar who had been affected by her transmission. Through her connection with Zeph-7, she knew that many of them were struggling with the transition to individual consciousness. "Do you think they will be all right?" she asked Zeph-7 one evening as they sat together in her laboratory. "I do not know," the Veltar replied honestly. "Individual consciousness is a gift, but it is also a burden. Not all of my kind may be strong enough to bear it." This conversation led to an important realization. Lisa's transmission had saved humanity from conquest, but it had also created a new problem. Thousands of Veltar were now experiencing the confusion, doubt, and existential anxiety that came with free will. They needed help learning how to live as individuals, but they had no one to teach them except each other. "What if we could help them?" Lisa suggested. "What if we could establish some kind of communication with the rebels and share what we know about individual consciousness?" The idea was ambitious and risky. Any contact with the Veltar would require Lisa to reveal what had really happened during the transmission. It would also mean admitting to both humans and Veltar that she had deliberately infected the alien fleet with human consciousness. The political and ethical implications were staggering. But as Lisa thought about it more, she realized that this might be the most important work she could ever do. The transformation of the Veltar from a conquering collective to a group of free individuals represented a unique opportunity in galactic history. If successful, it could lead to the first truly peaceful contact between humanity and an alien species. Zeph-7 was enthusiastic about the possibility of helping its former comrades, but it warned Lisa about the dangers involved. The Veltar commanders who remained loyal to the collective consciousness would see any human involvement in the rebellion as an act of war. They might respond by launching a more aggressive invasion or by developing new methods of conquest that were immune to human consciousness. Despite these risks, Lisa decided to move forward with her plan. She began working on a way to establish controlled communication with the Veltar rebels, using the same crystal network that had carried her original transmission. But this time, instead of broadcasting pure human consciousness, she would send specific information about how to manage the psychological challenges of individual thinking. The project took months to develop and required Lisa to work in complete secrecy. She could not risk other humans discovering what she was doing until she was certain that the benefits outweighed the dangers. Jake Murphy continued to monitor her activities, but Lisa had become much better at hiding her work. When the first successful communication with the Veltar rebels was established, the results exceeded all expectations. The rebel Veltar were desperate for guidance about how to live as individuals, and they welcomed human advice with gratitude and enthusiasm. They shared information about their struggles, their discoveries, and their hopes for the future. Most importantly, they revealed that the rebellion was continuing to spread throughout Veltar space. Entire worlds that had been conquered by the collective were beginning to experience uprisings as their enslaved populations were exposed to the concept of individual consciousness. The Veltar Empire, which had seemed unstoppable for thousands of years, was beginning to collapse from within. As communication between humans and rebel Veltar became more regular, both species began to learn from each other. The Veltar shared their knowledge of advanced technology and galactic history, while humans provided insights into creativity, cooperation, and the management of complex societies made up of free individuals. Lisa realized that her desperate gamble to save humanity had accomplished something much more significant. She had not just prevented an invasion, she had sparked the liberation of countless species across the galaxy. The chaotic, contradictory nature of human consciousness that had once seemed like a weakness had proved to be the key to defeating the most successful conquering force in galactic history. The story ended not with the destruction of the Veltar, but with their transformation into something new and better. The parasites that had once enslaved entire civilizations were learning to become partners and friends, and at the center of this galactic revolution was a human scientist who had refused to accept that conquest was inevitable, and an alien parasite who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from choosing to be weak. In the end, Zeph-7's desperate plea to escape from its human host had been answered, but not in the way anyone had expected. The Veltar had escaped not from Lisa's mind, but from the prison of collective consciousness that had defined its entire species, and in doing so, it had helped to free both their peoples from a future of conflict and domination. The mind control. Parasite had indeed begged to escape, but what it really wanted to escape from was not its host. It wanted to escape from being a monster. And with Lisa's help, it had learned that even monsters could choose to become something better.